Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to this Climate Change Colloquium organised by the ANU Climate Change Institute on the topic Climate Change, Ethics and Policy. And as an important duty at the beginning, we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. Moving to the more substantive part of the talk, of our presentation. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Mark Ropak. I'm the Director of the Climate Change Institute. And I'd like to frame today's discussion, which, as you know, has two wonderful speakers, Clive Hamilton and John Dryzek. And the framing for this discussion begins by considering the what we could call the areas of discourse, or the collection of dialogues, of multilogues around climate change in which we all participate. And we can arrange these roughly in a hierarchy with climate science right at the bottom, the natural sciences. And you'll recognise that this hierarchy proceeds roughly from natural science at the bottom to the human sciences and human affairs at the top. Climate science is sometimes taken as being settled, and in one sense that's true. We know well enough everything we need to do to know exactly the direction we need to take. In another sense, it is far from true, because we do not understand aspects of the way that the climate system works anything like well enough to know the dangers in which we are heading on any of the paths that we choose to take. We do not understand, for example, how fast Arctic ice is melting. We don't understand how fast methane is being released from Arctic systems. We don't understand how rainfall distributions are changing. We don't understand shifts in circulation patterns, particularly in the oceans. So, and we don't understand how all of this is interacting with the biosphere, both on land and in the oceans. So, in that sense, the science is far from settled. There are many, many critical questions. Next up the tree, we have climate impacts, the ways in which changes in the natural functioning of the Earth system, its climate, impact on humankind. Largely a question of natural science, and also very much alive as a set of research topics. Then we move into what we do. And I've just put here that our two very broadest strategies, adaptation and mitigation, leaving aside a few of the, let's call them outliers. On one side is the outlier of geoengineering, and Clive Hamilton has written extensively about that. On the other side is the current outlier, our preferred policy as a nation, which is to pretend that nothing is happening. That's also a response strategy, of course, and it carries dangers and consequences just as much as any of the other responses that we can take. Next, we have the set of policy and economic instruments that, in a sense, organise and modulate our responses, that help us as a society and as a world to govern and to carry through our responses. And then right at the top, we have the subject of today's discussion, the ethical framings that help us to condition, to make our important choices as to how we orient ourselves in lower parts of this hierarchy, and a phrase I've used, the narratives that help us to understand and tell both ourselves and others what our positions are. This is just one snapshot of the climate science. Here are 4 pathways that emissions can take over the next 2 centuries. The black line on the left is what they've done over the last 2 centuries. The only one that meets a 2-degree warming is the bottom one. The one at the top is between 4 and 5. And the challenges to address that bottom one, to take the bottom trajectory, of course, we know are extremely steep. And the bad news is that just at the moment, the one we're following is the top one. emissions over the last decade or so are glued to the red curve, the top curve, rather than the lower curve. However we frame this, it creates what could be called a challenge of sharing. We have a certain space in the atmospheric commons that can be occupied before we hit climate change, dangerous climate change. That space can be defined in a number of ways, but however it's defined, we have to share it. And we can do so in many ways, ranging from keep going with the distribution of emissions we have at the moment, that's on the left, through to share by population, that's on the right. And you see that the difference between those, in terms of who gets what share of the atmospheric commons, is absolutely massive. So this, in a sense, is one framing of the ethical dilemma that we're facing. Just to point out that this is one of a series of climate change colloquia that the Climate Change Institute is organising. The first one happened about 2 months ago on the subject of targets and progress. Today's is on ethics and policy. And the next two, you see the details there, in about a month's time, slightly less, we have a colloquium on the costs of climate change, costs being interpreted very broadly. So we're certainly not just talking economic costs of mitigation, we're talking the holistic costs of any path we choose. And the fourth one on the 4th of September, why facts and opinions both matter. And at the moment we have one property of the current multi-log in climate change is that there are some people who say that it's all to do with facts and others who say that it's all to do with opinions. And this is an attempt to see both of those perspectives within the one framework. So that's the future. Now to today. After a very quick chat with our two speakers, it emerges that in both cases they are likely to speak for about 20 minutes. So the suggested timing is slightly different from what's there. We propose that following this very short introduction, that we spend 20 minutes hearing Clive on the ethical dimensions of climate change, followed by a short 5-minute session for questions of clarification. Then for John Dryzek on climate justice and beyond, likewise followed by a short session, and then a discussion session, and we will evaluate how we're going at 5:30 and see if the discussion is still rolling on. If it is, we'll keep going. If not, we will close the meeting slightly before the 6 o'clock closing time. So that's the proposed order of service. And with that, I would like to introduce Clive Hamilton. Clive is he's a well-known author and public intellectual, and since 2008 he's been Professor of Public Ethics at the Centre of Applied Philosophy and Public Ethics, a joint centre with Charles Sturt University and the University of Melbourne. And he's based in the Charles Sturt University Canberra campus. And in 2012 he was appointed to one key role in the federal government, which was as a member of the Climate Change Authority. Recently, last night, as you will have noticed, thrown a lifeline from an unexpected source. Your mate, yeah. A mate to all of us, I'm sure, you'll agree. For 14 years until February 2008, Clive was the Executive Director of the Australia Institute, a progressive think tank that he founded. He holds an arts degree from the Australian National University and an economics degree from the University of Sydney, and a doctorate from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. And he's published a wide range of books, among the best known of which are Requiem from a Species, and the subtitle Why We Resist the Truth About Climate Change, and Earthmasters, The Dawn of the Age of Climate Engineering, to which I alluded just a moment ago. And of course he's also written extensively about growth. Growth Fetish is one of my personal favourites of your books, Clive. So I'd like you to welcome Clive Hamilton, who will speak to us on the ethical dimensions of climate change. Thank you, Clive.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Mike, for that introduction, and thanks to everyone for coming along today. A great deal has been written over the last 10 or 15 years on the ethics of climate change, and it's a subject that's been, in a way, thoroughly exhausted. And so I want to take a bit of a different tack. In his definitive book titled A Perfect Moral Storm, the ethicist Stephen Gardner argues that the way forward in a climate-changed world is so difficult, in part because, as he writes, we do not yet have a good understanding of many of the ethical issues at stake in global warming policy. We remain confused, he writes, about such vital questions as who should take responsibility for the current situation, how to preserve equity between generations, and how best to think about our responsibility towards non-human animals. But is it really so hard for us to know what we should do? The science is very clear. To avoid disastrous global warming, the nations of the world must begin immediately to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and continue to do so rapidly. We have a good idea of how much emission reduction each developing economy needs to commit on the basis of some fairly straightforward ethical principles, and we also have a pretty good idea of how soon large developing countries will have to follow suit. We already have a widely agreed set of principles to guide global action as embedded in the 1992 United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which has been ratified by virtually all nations, including the United States. The Kyoto Protocol elaborated on those principles and was likewise agreed to by all nations in 1997, including the United States, although, of course, in a display of bad faith, the United States, and for several years Australia, later reneged on its commitment. We know with certainty what must be done to avoid enormous harm, particularly to poor and vulnerable people around the world, a task rendered less onerous by the fact that all economic studies show that the transition to a low carbon energy system could be achieved at modest economic cost. Rather than creating a perfect moral storm, it seems to me that the ethical winds blow strongly in one direction. It's true, as Stephen Gardner writes, that the debate is plagued by what he calls moral corruption, quote, the subversion of our moral discourse to our own ends. Yet moral corruption prevails, not because the situation is inherently murky, but because confusion has been deliberately sown, and because the public and political representatives have sought reasons to shirk their ethical obligations. There are three kinds of actors in this process of moral subversion: those who tell the lies, those who repeat the lies, and those who allow themselves to be seduced by the lies. First, what of those who tell the lies? Moral confusion has been created by a well-funded and clever campaign launched in the 1990s aimed at casting doubt on the science of climate change. The strategy was developed in the United States, implemented by conservative think tanks, and funded largely by fossil fuel interests. The history of this campaign and its effects have now been carefully documented and explained, not least by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway in their book Merchants of Doubt. More recently, earlier this year in fact, the vast sums of so-called dark money that continue to flow into the denial machine have been documented in forensic detail by Robert Bruhl, an American sociologist. The campaign has been highly effective, and since then, it's been exported from the US to other countries, notably Australia, and in particular to Anglophone nations. The campaign to deny climate science turned global warming into a battleground of a wider cultural war. So, surveys in the United States show that among those who dismiss climate science, 3/4 describe themselves as conservative and only 3% as liberal, with the rest describing themselves as moderate in their political views. If you look back at the surveys that were conducted in the 1990s, before this campaign funded by the fossil fuel companies and prosecuted by right-wing think tanks and other conservative outlets in the United States, before that took hold and had its impact, if you look at the survey results, there was no difference in the mid and late 90s in views of Americans on global warming by political allegiance. Republicans and Democrats had the same views. The tactics used by think tanks, corporations and foundations in the climate science denial movement have been exposed in a large number of books and articles, sometimes based on the release of secret documents through court actions. And these tactics, and my list to follow has also been, or similar one has been compiled by a US legal academic, Donald Brown. The list of tactics include communicating to the public statements that are flagrantly untrue, cherry-picking data from climate science papers and reports to give an erroneous impression of their results and to undermine their validity, hiding the sources of funding to think tanks that carry out work that discredits climate science, and I might note all of these apply in Australia, and the Institute of Public Affairs, which is the principal source of climate denial in Australia, also keeps very secret its sources of funding. Creating front groups in order to conceal their backers and intentions. Same things happened in Australia. The Warbra Foundation, the Australian Environment Foundation are examples. Sullying the reputations of sincere scientists. Any number of Australian climate scientists can tell you how attempts have been made to sully their reputations. And lastly, intimidating and threatening scientists and others who speak out with a view to driving them from the public debate. These tactics involve deception, misinformation and coercion, all of which are ethically reprehensible. Yet, when something of immense importance is at stake, and what could be more important than the survival of the most vulnerable of the Earth's citizens in the face of famine, flood and epidemic, when so much is at stake, we owe an absolute allegiance to the truth and must put aside any ideological or financial discomfort that the truth may raise. Hiding this truth is the essential moral failing of those who deny the science of climate change. So much for those who tell the lies. What of those who repeat the lies? Well, in addition to those who manufacture them and engage in various deceitful strategies to undermine climate science, there are some who amplify the lies and contribute to the smearing of scientists for political or personal reasons. Collectively, they're sometimes known as the echo chamber and include newspaper editors and columnists. I know the name that came to all of your minds. Prominent bloggers, politicians and influential public figures. Such people, of course, claim to be speaking the truth. Reading their contributions to the debate, one is struck by the absolute conviction they hold that their stance is the only ethically defensible one. But, as in all instances where an understanding of a complex issue requires advanced expertise, those without training must decide not what to believe, but whom to believe. In this case, we are obliged to accept the verdict of those most qualified to deliver it, that is, those recognised within the community of scientists as the experts with the best knowledge and insight. And that status, of course, is achieved through successful participation in the system of peer-reviewed research, published in professional journals, which we know overwhelmingly endorses the main propositions of human-induced climate change. Yet some prominent individuals, with no expertise whatsoever, deem themselves capable of overruling the vast consensus amongst the qualified scientific researchers, and so they overrule it in order to prosecute a set of beliefs that have been rejected by every scientific academy in the world and have been systematically debunked by legitimate scientists. The Australian Cardinal George Pell, recently appointed to a senior administrative position in the Vatican, is a prominent case. In various speeches and newspaper articles, Pell has condemned established science and reproduced manifestly untrue, culled from various websites, claims made by people with no credibility as climate scientists and who are unwilling to submit their claims to the established processes of professional review. To explain away the consensus of opinion among qualified climate scientists, Pell resorts to conspiracy theories, suggesting that the IPCC is keeping certain statistics secret and that a, quote, small, tight-knit group of computer modelers is suppressing contradictory evidence. As a man of the cloth, Cardinal Pell has a particular obligation to tell the truth, especially as some Catholics believe that he would not mislead them. It should be said, as a coda, that against Cardinal Pell's fervent rejection of science, the Vatican has come down firmly on the side of science. What of the third and much larger category, those who are seduced by the lies? The denial campaign would not have been as influential if it had not cast the seeds of doubt on such fertile soil. Most members of the public in the United States and here in Australia, and particularly in the Anglophone countries, while not explicitly disavowing the science of climate change, and that's still the case in the US, have nevertheless deployed various psychological strategies to remove its sting. This kind of casual denial relies on such inner narratives as environmentalists always exaggerate, didn't those leaked ClimateGates emails show that it's all a bit dodgy, and I'll worry about it when the scientists make up their minds. Anxiety about the facts of climate science can be reduced simply by restricting exposure to upsetting information. I mean, we all do that, don't we? When something horrible famine comes on the television, we turn away unless we make a conscious decision to have a kind of strength to know, watch it and face up to it and recognise the horrible truth. But frequently we reduce our anxiety and our distress by excluding the facts that upset us, a kind of selective disengagement. The desire to disbelieve is activated by news outlets each time they give undue prominence to stories that create the impression that climate scientists cannot agree, or that the science is politically tainted. The Australian newspaper has campaigned systematically that way over several years, persistently publishing opinion pieces by climate deniers. They had another one the other day from a senior person appointed by senior business advisor to the new government. The Australian consistently publishes alleged news stories about scientific reports that systematically distort the message of those scientific reports and those scientific articles. And what the Australian and other news outlets do, particularly Murdoch-owned news outlets, is pander to this desire by many in the public to disbelieve the uncomfortable facts communicated to them by climate scientists. So the public uses self-deception to good effect. We tell ourselves humans have solved these kinds of problems before, or it's unfortunate, a lot of poor people in poor countries are going to suffer, but it won't affect me much. Alternatively, as a psychological strategy, we might divert attention from anxious thoughts and unpleasant emotions by engaging in minor behaviour changes, like switching to low-energy light bulbs, actions that help mollify feelings of helplessness and guilt. Perhaps the most widespread method of avoidance, however, is the practice of wishful thinking. Cultivating what the psychologist Shelley Taylor has called benign fictions can be, in everyday life, a comforting strategy in an often unfriendly world. I mean, which one of us hasn't, got a devastating set of referees' comments to a paper we've submitted, or overheard some nasty comment about our personal failings, and then over the next hours, days, reconstructed our sense of goodness by cultivating these benign fictions. Yet, such fictions become dangerous delusions when they are clung to despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The climate debate is rife with wishful thinking, such as the idea that technology will save us, faith in carbon capture and storage, and various geoengineering schemes are prominent examples of this kind of thinking. We cling to hope that something will save the day, no matter what the evidence, such as the evidence might put up about where global emissions are tracking and have been tracking for some years. We cling to hope no matter what. We prefer to remember that Martin Luther King proclaimed, "I have a dream," and do not want to be reminded that in a more reflective mood, he also wrote, "In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, 'too late.'" In rich countries, the panoply of psychological devices citizens use to deny, dilute, or distance the facts of climate science serve to absolve them of moral responsibility to avoid self-censure. And this enables them to carry on with their lifestyles and vote for governments that don't take global warming seriously. This kind of moral recklessness is perhaps a natural human failing, one that historically has been overcome by strong leaders whose moral clarity brings out the best in others. We all have a duty to the truth. A minority of citizens, quite small in most countries, has faced up to the full truth of climate change. Among scientists, they include James Hansen and Kevin Anderson. These citizens, not just scientists, but plenty of others, of course, are distinguished not necessarily by more advanced ethical sensibility, but by the fact that they do not allow themselves to use the various escape mechanisms that others have relied on. In other words, they exercise moral courage. If we look around our universities, we see that, in contrast to the view who have admitted the facts, most intellectuals who, at some level, know the truth of climate change and would never challenge any of the propositions of climate science, nevertheless act as if it's merely an abstraction. Some continue to write futuristic books without mentioning that the Earth will be profoundly transformed by warming, as if the dire warnings of the scientific of the scientific academies, and any number of Nobel Prize winners are some kind of peculiar obsession restricted to the scientists. So, in sum, and to conclude, I just want to say that at a time when the scientific case for strong action has become unassailable, the subversion of the moral discourse by those who tell the lies, by those who amplify them, and by those who are seduced by them, has become so pervasive that it's taken us outside of the normal moral discourse. The world has to accept moral responsibility before it can make ethical judgments. Before we can wrestle with an ethical dilemma, we must accept that we are responsible moral agents. Humanity's ethical impulse has been receding as the call for it has become ever more clamorous. We are not confused, we're weak, and will respond to the warnings when we find, from somewhere, the strength to do so. Thank you.
And we will now welcome John Dryzek. John is a centenary professor in the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the ANZOG Institute for Governance at the University of Canberra. And before that, he was a distinguished professor of political science and an Australian Research Council fellow at this university. He's a fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences, a former head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Oregon and also in Melbourne, and of the Social and Political Theory program at ANU. And he's a former editor of the Australian Journal of Political Science. His work is in both political theory and the empirical social sciences, and he's best known for his contributions in the area of democratic theory and practice and environmental politics. And he has instigated, one of the instigators, of the deliberative turn in democratic theory, publishing on this topic 5 books with Oxford University Press and Polity Press. And his work in environmental politics ranges from green political philosophy to studies of environmental discourses and movements towards global environmental governance in that area. That's the one in which I know his work best. He's worked on comparative studies of democratization, post-positivist public policy and analysis, and the history and philosophy of social science. And his current research emphasises global justice, governance in the Anthropocene, and the cultural variety in deliberative justice. And that makes Clive a wonderful person to speak to us now on the subject climate justice and beyond. So, pardon me, Clive, John. Thank you, John, and please welcome John Dryzek.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Okay, in my talk, I actually have a bit more sympathy than Clive revealed with Stephen Gardner's depiction of climate change as presenting a perfect moral storm. And I'm actually going to be emphasising a degree of variety of ethical positions that it's possible to take when it comes to climate change. I'll be emphasising climate justice because ethics is largely, although as I will say at the end of my talk, not completely a matter of justice. I'll start with this picture of a group of protesters at one of the UNFCCC negotiations. Climate justice or climate chaos. Now, what do these protesters actually mean by climate justice? I think if you ask them, you would probably get a sense that they recognise that those who are responsible for climate change are not those who are most vulnerable to its effects. So there is a justice dimension there, an ethical dimension. However, if you press them a bit more closely than that, it might be hard to get a more precise picture of what climate justice actually means. Now, if we look at climate governance in general, especially global climate governance, it's not hard to locate the language of justice actually being used. So, for example, in the original agreement that set up the UNFCCC in 1992, there was a reference famously to common but differentiated responsibilities across the countries of the world for doing something in response to climate change. That common but differentiated responsibilities points directly to some conception of justice, although, as I will show in a moment, it is actually a very limited and partial conception of justice. If we fast forward a bit to the Kyoto Protocol, the distinction between Annex I countries, which had a responsibility for emissions mitigation, and the rest, again, rests on a conception of justice, that there are certain countries which do have both the responsibility to act and the capacity to act, the Annex I countries, and it is a matter of justice, essentially, that the burden of action falls upon them. Okay. I should warn you that this talk is going to have some product placement in it, and this is the first. This is the first such placement. We do have a chapter in this book was published last year by myself and my co-authors Dick Norgard and David Schlossberg. Notice the image we've got there of somebody walking away from a wrecked roller coaster. This is on the New Jersey shore in the aftermath of Superstorm Sandy. Anyway, we do talk quite a bit about justice in that book. We have a chapter on climate justice. What does climate justice mean? It can actually mean several things, I think. The conception of justice, which is embodied in the original UNFCCC establishment and also in the Kyoto Protocol, is very much a conception of international justice. And this is really the kind of justice that dominates when justice arises, especially in the UN-sponsored negotiations. International justice treats nations as the units of analysis. So some nations have responsibilities and obligations. Others have different responsibilities, obligations. Perhaps some have none. The idea of cosmopolitan justice is also global in its remit, but rather than take nations as its unit of analysis, it takes individuals as its unit. Why does that make a difference? It makes a difference because it recognizes that there are poor people in rich countries and there are rich people in poor countries, and the obligations should fall differentially on rich and poor, no matter where they live. For example, China now has a very large population of wealthy consumers. Should they be under any less obligation than similarly large populations of consumers in developed Western countries? Historical justice is essentially backward-looking. The argument here is generally made that, okay, there are some countries which have built their wealth and prosperity on a long history of fossil fuel use, so those countries have a particular responsibility to act, compared to countries which have developed more recently and countries which have developed much less. So that's looking back. And that can be controversial. The US in particular rejects, or at least the US negotiators reject the historical view of justice. It's fair to say the US Congress does too. A conception of justice which is much more amenable to the US in particular emphasizes fairness in the terms of trade. So the US negotiators often argue that that we should look forward rather than back, and that in looking forward, the US should not disadvantage itself by taking on burdens that its competitors, such as China, do not have to also take on. So that is a conception of justice. It may be partial and it may be self-serving, but it is a conception of justice. Intergenerational justice. This is something which has been the preserve of philosophers rather than political actors, but concerns justice towards future generations not yet born. Although it's also fair to say that some philosophers dispute that there is such a coherent thing as intergenerational justice. Though that perhaps says more about the decadence of moral philosophy as a discipline rather than anything that should have any real world traction. Ecological justice, that was raised in a question just now. This attempts to take a non-anthropocentric, a much more biocentric view of justice and would incorporate the non-human world as containing subjects of justice as well, be they ecosystems, species, individual creatures. So that's ecological justice. And then accompanying all of these conceptions of justice, there are, especially ones that emphasize individuals, such as cosmopolitan justice, there are all kinds of accounts of specific rights and needs that can be claimed, that can be met, that should be met, but are often denied in a climate context. I'll just skate over the details of those for the moment. Okay, what happens when these conceptions of justice enter the real world of climate politics and global climate politics in particular? Some of them fare better than others. If a particular conception of justice can be attached to the material interest of some key actor or actors in the system, then that conception of justice is likely to fare relatively well. And so I've already suggested that fairness in the terms of trade as a conception of justice is attached quite easily to the US negotiating position. The idea of historical justice that is also international, nations as its unit of analysis, has also been is also very consistent with the position taken by the G77 group of developing countries plus China in their negotiating position, that they've argued that as a matter of historical justice, the burden of action should fall on the wealthier developed states. Justice also encounters discourses. A discourse, we can actually, it's possible to understand the global politics of climate change, not just in terms of interests, competing interests and how they fare in negotiations, but also in terms of discourses. A discourse is a shared means of making sense of the world embedded in language, enabling the assemblage of bits of information into coherent accounts. That's a bit of a mouthful. But the world of global governance, well, actually governance in general, is often largely composed of competing discourses. Examples might include sustainable development, the dominant global discourse of environmental concern over the last 30-odd years. Market liberalism, or neoliberalism, which is the dominant discourse of the global financial system. And these have power that don't necessarily reduce to the material interests of actors. And sometimes discourses can actually help create material interest because they give actors a sense of what their interests are. Okay, a bit more product placement. In this book, which is published this year, we actually do try to map the global constellation of discourses surrounding global climate governance. What we don't do, and in retrospect, what we could have done, was try to map conceptions of justice, of climate justice, onto this constellation of discourses. So in thinking about this talk, I made a start of that, but I also realized just what a lot of work there is to be done, that needs to be done on that. Sometimes there isn't much mapping. Some of the discourses that are prominent in global climate governance pretty much ignore justice. And so examples of that would be ecological modernization, which tends to take a very sort of technological approach to things, sees clean technology allied to capitalism as promoting both economic growth and mitigation of global emissions. Climate marketization, again, a discourse becoming increasingly prominent in terms of emissions trading schemes, carbon markets, offset schemes. Often climate marketization, generally justice concerns don't figure in that at all. But also, from a very different direction, the older discourse of limits, going back to the limits of growth to the 1970s, and the more recent discourse of planetary boundaries, doesn't really have much to say about justice. So in some discourses, justice just doesn't register. In other discourses, we can find conceptions of justice. So ecological justice and basic needs we find in a discourse of green radicalism, which is at the margins of the official negotiations, much more prominent in civil society activity surrounding the global governance of climate change. We find international justice, and often some cosmopolitan recognition of basic needs in a discourse that we described as expansive sustainability. But this is a discourse that actually exists somewhat on the margins of civil society gatherings, to a degree in both business gatherings and social movement gatherings, but its presence is somewhat marginal. I should also note that the discourse of denial of climate change can itself appeal to a conception of justice. It wouldn't be called a conception of climate justice, but a libertarian view of justice, as set out by, quite famously by the philosopher Robert Nozick, for example, does meet the formal requirements of a theory of justice. It's about the allocation of benefits and burdens in society and can be applied to global society as well. It's very individualistic. It's one which does not accept any active role for government, which believes very strongly in private property and exchange in markets. But it is a conception of justice, even though, as I say, in the realm of climate justice, it's not usually recognized as such. And some conceptions of justice find weak presence in any of the discourses that we find surrounding the global governance of climate change. So I think cosmopolitan and intergenerational justice are fairly weakly present in that respect. Okay. Now, having emphasized justice as central to climate ethics, I'm now going to suggest that justice is actually not the whole story when it comes to the ethical dimensions of climate change. John Rawls, who was the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, famously began his classic book, A Theory of Justice, by asserting that justice is the first virtue of social institutions. So that should be the first goal of all social institutions, according to Rawls. I'm not sure that claim was actually repeated in a very good book on climate change called Atmospheric Justice by Steve van der Heijden, published a few years ago. He appealed to Rawls in saying why he focused first and foremost on justice in the context of climate change. I think that claim is actually becomes harder to sustain if indeed we have entered what Will Stephan and others have called the Anthropocene, an era of human-induced instability in the Earth system. So in this light, John Rawls is not necessarily just the most important political philosopher of the whole 20th century. We could also categorize him as a late Holocene political philosopher. In the Anthropocene, I would argue that the core problem of social institutions is not injustice as such. The core problem in those social institutions is their path dependency, their capacity to perpetuate themselves into a different sort of era, but in a way that allows them to generate feedbacks which avoid, especially the ecological dimensions of that era. We can think of, for example, markets that generate feedback loops, avoiding ecological systems. We can think of the institutions of global finance, which positioned themselves as too big to fail. So they encounter global financial crisis in 2008, and they emerge afterwards in pretty much the same form as that in which they entered the crisis. They've established a very strong degree of path dependency, which enables them to survive crisis, but not in a way that would prevent future crisis. Even something like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has arguably secured a degree of path dependency. It becomes the focus of the activities, especially the activities of lots of civil society actors, global social movements, even though it doesn't seem to be producing very much, or at least not enough to actually meet the challenge it was set up to meet. Yet nonetheless, it remains the focus of these sorts of efforts. It has developed a lot of actors who just have a stake in its routines, who show up every year at its proceedings, despite the fact that there could conceivably be other locations in the global system where their efforts might be better spent. And the UNFCCC seems unable to reform its practices in the light of its manifest failures, such as, for example, the need in its proceedings to secure something like unanimity, the ability to of any of the parties to object to any clause in any proposed agreement, and that must be then dealt with. That must be somehow talked out, somehow sort of talked through and recognised in draft texts. So I think it's widely recognised that often leads to that generally leads to a lot of impasse, but nevertheless the institution itself moves on, or rather it moves on. It doesn't really change itself. It remains largely unchanged in the way it works. The opposite to path dependency can be called reflexivity, the capacity to be something different, not just to do something different. And that's, I think, something that we do not currently observe in the UNFCCC. It doesn't seem to be able to generate the antidote to problematic path dependence. But it's not just reflexivity that matters in the Anthropocene. It's something it's reflexivity with an ecosystemic dimension, which also involves listening more effectively to the Earth system and the signals emanating from it, the ability to seek, receive, and respond to early warnings about potential ecological state shifts, and the capacity to question core values such as justice in this light. So, in other words, justice is not just something to be asserted and pursued, it's something that needs to be deliberated. At the outset, I set out a number of different conceptions of climate justice. I think it's by no means obvious which of those should prevail. Should it be international versus cosmopolitan? I have a lean towards cosmopolitan, but I can see the arguments for international. So there are a number of competing questions of justice which will lead us lead us in different directions. But justice itself, as I say, is not just something that should be asserted and then pursued. It's something that continually needs to be deliberated in reflexive fashion. So I'll finish that.